grateful we are for this collaboration with the LGBT Center. This has been a wonderful experience for us. We're so happy to have been able to bring so many of our Zygote artists and our community artists and to experience the very inclusive and collaborative environment of the center and the team that we have had the privilege to work with. And of course, we're particularly happy to be able to have all of the amazing art up on the walls here that documents some of the experiences of queer history and the current queer community in Cleveland. I'm going to introduce you now to the amazing co-curator of this exhibition. His name is Brittany Hudak, and he is our senior program manager and gallery manager extraordinaire over at Zygote Press. In addition to being the senior program manager and gallery manager at Zygote Press, Brittany Ann Hudak, her, is an art historian. She received an MA in art history from the University of Cincinnati with a focus of 19th century photography and women's photo albums, doing key research at the Victoria and Albert Museum of London. She also holds a Master of Arts distinction from the University of London in Victorian Media and Culture. At Case Western Reserve University, in their joint program with the Cleveland Museum of Art, she worked on her PhD in art history, focusing on networks of artistic exchange and travel in the 19th century. She has taught undergraduate art history at Case Western Reserve University and Cleveland State University, and has curated many exhibitions across Northeast Ohio. At Zygote Press, she has developed programming that incorporates art history into community-engaged programs, using printmaking as an entry point to build equitable modes of engagement and to affect change in our broader community. Please help me welcome the one and only Brittany Hudak. Thank you for that lovely introduction. So, Jackie. The title of my talk today is The Independent Women of Provincetown, Queerness and Networks of Printmaking. It's an ongoing research project that I've been working on for several years, and I couldn't be happier to present this topic here, right now, this week, in a safe space and in community here at the center. So thanks again to the center for having me. But before I begin, here, this is a slide with the title. Before I begin, I want to recognize the people whose work inspired me to start this research in the first place. Firstly, the 2010 exhibition held at the CMA of the work of Mabel Hewitt, which was organized by then curator Prince Jamie Glaubinger. It was a rare opportunity to see a number of white line woodcuts and blocks, which we'll talk more about later, by the renowned Cleveland artist Mabel Hewitt. And as for theoretical framework, I'm indebted to the scholarship of Karen Krahulik. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce her name. Her dissertation and subsequent book on the history of Provincetown queer culture asked scholars to pay closer attention to methodologies and practices that combine rather than separate out queer history. And separate out queer history or separate out politics or separate out communities. She stresses that the global mechanics of capitalism led to the local queering and eventually unqueering of the gentrified, extremely white, gay enclave at Provincetown. But we'll get it. I really, that Kate Queer case study of Provincetown. If you're a nerd, really good reading. Speaking of Provincetown, to begin my talk, I wanted to give a brief overview of the town itself. Has anyone ever been there? Oh, so lucky. I've never been, so I want you all to know I have not been there, but I can talk about it. It's on the northernmost tip of Cape Cod. You can see it there in the red. The seaside town is on the site of the Mayflower's Landing in 1620, an event that is commemorated by a towering pilgrim monument, which you can see in the postcard there. It's about 4 miles long. It's kind of like a provincial, quaint New England village, just to give you the feel of it. And it's barely more than 2 miles wide at any point. So
It's very small. It's surrounded by beautiful blue water and sandy beaches. It's also known as Land's End, Cape Tip, Cape End, and to some, Queersville, USA, or P-Town. I think people say P-Town quite a lot. Provincetown has meant different things to different people over the years. From the very first Anglo-European colonial settlers, who I just mentioned, who then began importing laborers primarily from Portugal, these two groups began jockeying for the town's limited space and economic resources. Portuguese sailors and their families developed the neighborhood on the west end of town, while the white Yankees lived on the east. But when in 1898, the Portland Gale, which we're guessing was a hurricane, but they called it a gale back then, it severely damaged the town's fishing industry and things started to shift. Like many colonial seaside towns, Provincetown handled the decline of its lucrative 19th century fishing industry by turning its rotting wharves, derelict roads, and scenic beaches into a tourist destination. And it was artists who actually played a key role in this transformation. Provincetown was filled with abandoned buildings after the fishing community left that were affordable, and as word got out, artists began flocking to the village. As the town began to be rumored to be artsy, meaning tolerant of difference in the name of creativity, queer men and women increasingly visited from places of intolerance. Although a similar thing was happening around the same time in Greenwich Village, not all art colonies become gay meccas like Provincetown. And it's here that I want to acknowledge that Provincetown has always been and will always be a destination for the privileged. And it still is today. In fact, it's probably more so today than even it was in the 90s. The artists I will be talking about are all white and affluent financially. And despite the fact that they were seeking freedom in Provincetown, once there, they in turn start ending up creating new forms of discrimination, displacing the very people that welcomed them there in the first place, which we'll talk about. The artists that transformed Provincetown into an art colony were not queer in the beginning, nor were they progressive. In fact, they were in the main very conservative men. In 1899, Charles Webster Hawthorne opened the Cape Cod School of Art, said to be the first outdoor school for figure painting in America. What made Hawthorne so key to the transformation of Provincetown into an art colony was his decision not only to paint at Land's End, but also to give instruction there. So he's teaching art. On any summer day, you could easily come across Hawthorne teaching a large group of elegantly dressed women painting on the waterfront. His school attracted hundreds of art students, dozens of well-known artists, and multitudes of tourists that actually would go to watch them paint. Like watch this kind of meta, right? They're looking at the view and then they're painting, and then there's tourists looking at them painting the view and the view at the same time. You could even buy postcards to send home that just had the painting stuff on it, like pictures of people painting. In 1900, the modernist Ambrose Webster opened his summer school of painting, and then after that, it was like an avalanche. More schools opened. By 1916, so this is just, 16 years later, roughly 600 artists and students were spending their summers in Provincetown at 6 different art schools. Artist Marsden Hartley called it the Great Summer of 1916. Many artists like Hartley had recently returned to America from Berlin, London, and Paris because of the outbreak of World War I. They had experienced the relaxed attitudes towards sex and gender in those cities, and they liked it. And then, getting word that there was a similar town on Cape Cod open to such people, these artists started flocking to the seaside village. The Boston Globe ran a page-one story headlined, "Biggest Art Colony in the World in Provincetown" in 1916. As Provincetown became a serious place to study art, with it came reports of the artists' risque summertime antics. Outrageous parties, gender-bending costume balls. Increasingly, Provincetown became a place where people with non-traditional sexual preferences could safely explore their identity. Free thinkers from Greenwich Village began to flock to Provincetown, including queer painters like Marsden Hartley, who you see here, Charles Demuth, and Eugene O'Neill, his partner, are in the center image. And then on the right is the Beachcombers Club, which was an all-male. They did a lot of reviews and cabaret nights. Sounds fun. Some of it, and some of this had to do with Provincetown's remoteness. It's virtually surrounded by water. So the town's isolation let visitors kind of shed their inhibitions and anonymity. And some of it had to do with the Portuguese boarding house owners that I talked about earlier. Confirmed bachelors and maiden ladies, uh, which are all coded words, formed trusting relationships with their Portuguese hosts and hostesses who were eager to have the additional income and were not bothered by any of this so-called impropriety. As long as sex and gender bending men and women were white and armed with income to spare, the Portuguese homeowners were pleased to take them in. It was in this complex framework of conservative art schools, open gay and lesbian artists, and welcoming Portuguese hosts that a group of printmakers banded together to form what they called the Provincetown Printers. It was a convergence of Paris, Japan, Chicago, and Cincinnati, the result of the networks of artists moving between American art schools, the ateliers of Paris, and simultaneously the influence of Japanese art that all synced in the summer of 1915. Before the age of computers, artists largely worked and traveled by word of mouth, making associations with like-minded individuals, traveling together, supporting each other, and teaching each other new techniques and ideas. In this world of artistic and economic privilege, some were able to openly express their sexual proclivities, and Provincetown offered just that, a space of possibility rather than limitation. In this talk, I'm focusing on how women artists that did not fit into traditional gender roles gravitated towards printmaking in this time period. I use the term queer to describe these women artists almost exclusively. Queer embraces the manifold sexual preferences of these women, but most importantly, it acknowledges that these women's non-heterosexuality. My interest is exploring the connection between female sexual dissidence and the practices of art in this time period and how those two intertwine. Nearly all of the Provincetown printers had visited Europe and had a chance to study printmaking either in Paris, Germany, or at another art school. But it is important to note that women were traditionally very much excluded from professional print shops at this time. Techniques such as lithography and etching were often considered too physically demanding for women to pursue professionally. But as you can see, a vast majority of these Provincetown printers that you've just seen were indeed women, and many of them were also queer. All of them were fluent and had more opportunities than most to learn printmaking, but none of them had a press in Provincetown. In fact, there wasn't a press in Provincetown in this era. And the lack of an accessible press, due to the lack of an accessible press, and because of their transient nature, so these artists are moving around between Paris, New York, and Provincetown, it was the white line technique that many of them chose to use, precisely because you don't need a press or access to a print shop to create these kind of prints. So what exactly is the white line technique? This is a pretty good picture, someone making a white line print. It begins with a simple linear design in pencil on the wood plate, and then only the lines are gouged away to reveal into these kind of slender grooves. Then you tack a sheet of paper, a moistened paper, to one edge of the block so that it can be folded over, and it assures then registration. So then with watercolors, you actually paint onto the wood surface. The chiseled grooves create they separate these colored cells and keep the paint from running together and mixing. Laying the paper onto the ink surface, then the print is made by rubbing the back of the sheet with a simple burnishing tool like a wooden spoon or fair. The resulting image has distinctive white lines where the grooves separate the colors. So you can see there in the top, you can see the white lines. This differs very greatly from the traditional method of creating multicolored woodblock prints, which requires the artist to carve a separate block for each color, and then carefully registering the paper for each impression to create the finished image. So you can see here, pretty good example for like a 3-color print. You actually have 3 separate blocks, or 2-color, 2 separate blocks. Not only is the traditional method more labor intensive, the white line method encourages the artist to create extremely linear, flat, and oftentimes geometric compositions, which were favored by artists that consider themselves to be modern and admired the work of European modernists who were likewise employing flat, geometric images like the Cubists, for example. It was also the influence of the European modernists and their affinity for Japanese Mokuhanga prints that led to the white line method of printmaking. Here we see Hokusai's The Great Wave, which is a single print made from at least 8 different wood blocks. So imagining making that just gives me hives. By the turn of the century, Japanese prints were all the rage in Paris, influencing an entire generation of artists. This trend, known as Japanisme, coincided with modern art's radical upending of the Western artistic tradition and had significant effects on Western painting and printmaking. Many late 19th century modern artists not only admired and collected Japanese prints, they derived and adopted both compositional and stylistic approaches from them. Here we can see a painting by Whistler of a young woman wearing a full Japanese costume looking at prints. And here are some of Van Gogh's copies of prints. You can see on the right, that's actually a painting after Hiroshige. And here's another one. These are paintings, but he's still copying the compositional flatness and the point of view. And some artists like Mary Cassatt, who was incredibly wealthy, actually had access to printing presses and were copying Japanese prints, but with Western techniques such as dry point. So this is a dry point. I'm not going to go into it, but just know there's no wood involved. All right. And doing dry points or lithographs at this time required you to have access to a press. Mary Cassatt was so wealthy that she was able to escape many of the limitations, but that's another talk. None of these artists were attempting to recreate the traditional Mokuhanga woodblock prints simply because of the extremely detailed technical expertise and the time required to make them. But they all admired the look of Japanese prints and the ease with which one can make prints from a woodblock without using a press. Somehow, all of these networks that I just said converged, and networks of influence and artistic knowledge converged around 1915 in Provincetown, when the artist B.J.O. Nordfeld supposedly invented, air quotes, the white line technique. So here's an example of, his picture was a few slides ago. Here's an example of a white line print by B.J.O. Nordfeld. In an often referenced quote from artist Ada Gilmore, who was recalling this moment nearly 40 years later, she attributes this discovery to Nordfeld. She said, quote, "One day he surprised the others by exhibiting one block with his complete design on that, instead of parts of it being cut on 5 or 6 blocks. He had cut a groove into the wood to separate each color, and in printing this, left a white line which emphasized the design. With this invention, he had produced a more beautiful picture and eliminated much work." Immediately, woodblock printing was revolutionized. Being able to see the complete picture on one piece of wood, like a painting on a canvas, gave new possibilities for creative work in that medium. Okay, again, this is 40 years later, she's recalling this. So whether or not that's true, it's not known. But what definitely did happen was that a group of women, many of whom were queer, immediately took up this method as their primary way of art making. Returning to Provincetown year after year, they not only made white line printing a popular form of art, they also started teaching students in Provincetown that technique, who then returned to their hometowns, eager to share their knowledge with others. Speaking of Ethel Mars, Maud Squire and Ethel Mars were both from very affluent Cincinnati families. They met at the Art Academy of Cincinnati, where they were both kind of rock stars of the illustration department. So much so that as they were students, their illustrations were shown in a joint exhibition at the Cincinnati Art Museum in 1903. So they're doing fine, right? In 1906, after graduation, the couple moved to France and began traveling through Europe. Among their notable friends in Paris was Gertrude Stein, the lesbian writer and art collector. They were very active in her Paris salon, so much so that Stein wrote a short story titled Miss Fur and Miss Skeen in 1922 that is based on Ethel and Maud. It contains oblique references to the artist's lives, such as visiting family and Squire's brother in Paris. It uses frequent repetition. The story uses the word gay over 100 times, and I even found this cute little meme with the quote. So they were regularly gay. They were gay every day. They ended every day in the same way at the same time, and they had been every day regularly gay. And it just goes on. It's very humorous. As you can see in the, gay is in this sense is used to mean homosexual about 50 years before that became common. It plays on the multiple meanings of gay, referring to their relationship, but also happy attitudes and how they loved vivid colors in dress and in their art. They were noted for their bold personal fashion choices. They often dyed their hair purple. Flamingo orange was a popular hair color as well. God knows what they were putting on their hair. Probably like lead. And the half bleached and half black look was also common in Paris at this time. They wore heavily colorful makeup and bright clothing. Their appearances were compared to Fauvist paintings. So if you've ever seen the work of the Fauve artists, we're talking like crayon colors. In Munich, they learned, and this is what they finally left Paris and they went to Munich and they learned there how to make woodcuts, which became the focus of their practice. But this is an auspicious time. We're talking like 1913. Not a great time to be in Europe. So after the outbreak of World War I, Ethel and Maud relocated to Provincetown. There, the women became close to the other Provincetown artists known for their white line woodcuts, and Ethel Mars in particular embraced this white line technique, making several prints depicting the town. Here's one that shows a couple of ladies working in their garden, and you can see the distinctive white lines and the bright colors. Here's a dance, I guess, somewhere, but this is actually just a woodcut. A lot of times they made very simple woodcuts where they would actually hand color the colors and then just do like one color and then actually watercolor the rest of the colors. It's confusing. Doesn't matter. Here's a white line one. Here's a, kind of like a relaxing view in a backyard. A woman with a fan and sunflowers is a really lovely print. Mars's composition often featured the private spaces of women, such as this dressing room image here. At this time, women were still required to wear ridiculously large wool swimming suits in public, as you can see on the figure in the right. The woman on the left is dressed pretty flamboyantly, with a short bob haircut reflecting their modern attitudes in dress and appearance. These queer women artists working in Provincetown, like I said, often dyed their hair crazy colors, cut their hair into fashionable bobs, and wore eccentrically bright clothing. All of this was part of signaling, not only, to identify them as artists, but also as queer women or independent women, as the press so often referred to them. Independent, implying that they lived their lives without the support of men, but also may hint to their sexuality. As one writer put it, Mars and Squire lived a life independent of man's conventions. Amen. Maud Hunt Squire, the other half of this couple, worked with color wood blocks while in Provincetown as well, but used, like I said, a very simplified multicolor technique. I had to include this photo of Maud in Provincetown with their cat, of course. Yes. Come on. Her compositions were greatly inspired by the seaside towns, boats, harbors, fishing culture. She would make two blocks, one for the colors that she would paint on, and then would make a key block for the black outlines on top. So even though there's like, a lot of colors in this, there's only two blocks being employed. This is the kind of innovation that woodblock printing allowed artists. And Maud Squire's experimentation with the medium shows how far one artist ran with these ideas. Like the other Provincetown printers, her compositions are angular, geometric, with flat, broad areas of simplified color. Her prints of bathers from the artistic set and Portuguese fishermen show the dichotomy of a town that was rapidly changing from an industrial seaport to the playground for elite white vacationers. So there on the left, you can see, oh God, it must be so uncomfortable to be in a wet woolen bathing suit, but that's what they're doing. And then on the right, these are actually fishermen that were working there still. Mars and Squire formed a small professional social circle with other same-sex couples and artists. Two women in particular who worked with Maud and Ethel in Europe, then learned about Provincetown and joined them there, were Ada Gilmore and Mildred Dolly McMillan. Likewise unconventional in looks and attire, they were another relatively out couple in Provincetown, making prints at this time. Like Maud Hunt and Ethel Mars, they met at art school, but this time in Chicago at the Art Institute of Chicago. And then they went to France, where they both studied woodblock printing with Ethel Mars. And undoubtedly, that's also when she told them about Provincetown as a location to go. And in 1915, this couple joined Mars and Squire in Provincetown, where, unlike most artists, they lived at the tip of Cape Cod through the winter. You can see here, this is their Christmas card. It's a woodcut from 1918. And of course, Pico the cat gets name drops, which is awesome. Gilmore and McMillan were a curator recently described them as housemates, which I think is very funny. They're also frequently called companions. Their sexual relationship is really irrelevant here, but what is relevant is that they lived for a number of years in Provincetown as an open same-sex couple. Maiden ladies like Mars and Squire and Gilmore and McMillan were so frequently referred to as independent women, not because they lived alone, but because they lived independently of men in men's world. Gilmore's white line woodcuts often depict women and are among the most modern, patterned, and brightly colored of all the Provincetown prints. This print, called Provincetown Harbor, depicts a group of mermaids playing on the shore. And you will notice there is a thread here of female nudity as well. So here's one called Provincetown. So she's focusing on the female nude here, kind of in an idealized pose, but she's placed the figure into this picturesque village scene. You know, you would be able to recognize exactly what churches and houses these are. So it's kind of outrageous that there's this naked woman like sitting on the hillside looking down at Provincetown. Perhaps implying the artist's liberal attitude towards sexual mores. Whether or not she used live models, it doesn't really matter. The attitude is one of freedom, right? Of the ability to be yourself. Ada Gilmore's white line prints almost always depict women, like this portrait of two sisters. Here you can see the white line technique allows the composition to be made up of puzzle-like pieces of color that fit together and very flat decorative surfaces that makes a very simple geometric composition. Now, if you're making multiples of these, each one you have to hand paint, right? So you paint the block again, and you can kind of change the color. So you can actually, you can change the color scheme as you go along if you want to. Or you can do things like put polka dots on one and maybe not on the other. So each print is kind of like a monoprint. They are a little bit individually different. Sail Loft. I also love when Gilmore depicts women just kind of being women, not posing like odalesques. Like this image from 1919 that shows a woman changing out of her swimming costume on the beach in public. Whoa. Not in a dressing room like we've seen before. But I love this because Gilmore is capturing the relaxed atmosphere of Provincetown where you would actually feel comfortable enough, and they do look comfortable being themselves in public on a beach where I could do a whole thing on beach etiquette for women, and they were not doing any of that, but they could get away with it at Provincetown. And it's in her thoroughly modern, brightly colored prints. And you can even see that she wrote Sail Loft up on the top, which she would have had to do backwards. Conversely, her partner, Dolly, was really simplistic. She worked exclusively in black and white. This lent her woodcuts a very modern, simplistic look, and really set her apart from her contemporaries who were almost all working with very bright colors. Here you can see a view of the street scene and harbor, though it's through a window, an almost photographic composition that she has created with just simple black lines. She exhibited one of these block prints in the first annual exhibition of the Provincetown Art Association in 1915. McMillan went on to make black and white woodcuts in Massachusetts until her death at age 59. So I don't remember when Gilmore died, but She stayed there her whole life. The Cleveland Museum of Art has two excellent examples of her work in their collection. And in addition to their simplicity and palette, McMillan worked large, much larger than everything else I know this is hard when you're looking on this giant screen. Everything else you've seen was like basically like 8 by 10. But this is much larger. This is 17 by 20, which is pretty big. When Gilmore and McMillan's complex relationship While Gilmore and McMillan's complex relationship continues to confound historians, it also suggests that sexuality in this crowd was not as obvious as it always seemed. Gilmore actually went on to marry a man and then left him and came back. Other artists such as Hartley and Demuth also were married and in heterosexual relationships, even though obviously they were both interested in men. But in Provincetown during this era, queerness is not always easily defined, just like now, and unfortunately, it wasn't always safe. I don't want to make it sound like it was this mecca where everything was fine and perfect, because there is a bad side. Earlier, I mentioned that the invention of the white line technique was attributed to this guy, Nordfeld, but in the 1990s, a discovery in an attic proved otherwise. In a trunk in that attic were thousands of paintings, blocks, and prints by Edith Lake Wilkinson, a queer artist that lived with her partner Fanny in Provincetown, and whose white line prints are dated to 1914, a full year before Nordfeld and the others took up the technique. Amazingly, Edith's blocks still survived in that trunk. So you can see here on the left, this is actually the woodcut. This is the stained, it's stained with the colors that were used, giving the rare opportunity to see her entire practice as a whole. You get to see the block and the print. And you can see the almost luminescent colors that she uses. I'm talking about the fauves again. That yellow is very yellow. You know, these are very, very bright colors, and it had to do with the actual pigment that was available at the time too. I could do another presentation on that, about how you could get colors this bright out of a tube at this time. You know, this was a new invention. Well, newish anyway. Her work nearly always featured picturesque scenes of village life, but the unusually bright and unrealistic palette she used shows an allegiance to the modernist whose work she saw at the Armory Show in New York in 1913, which she talks about in some letters. Ethel actually never made it to Paris, but had planned a trip for 1924. So just a few years after this, and you can see the block there on the left. If not for her great-grandniece, filmmaker Jane Anderson, Wilkinson's importance to Provincetown would have been lost. Her discovery of that trunk led her to create a documentary about her great aunt. Packed in a Trunk, The Lost Art of Edith Lake Wilkinson examines the life of a brilliant artist whose career was tragically cut short by prejudice and greed. Wilkinson and her partner Fanny lived together in Provincetown, as I said, rather peacefully until a family lawyer had Edith committed to an insane asylum in 1924 to forcefully separate the two of them. He then siphoned all the money that was left to Edith by her prosperous family, and he packed her artwork into that trunk where it sat in the family attic. Tragically, Edith spent the rest of her life confined in asylums and never was allowed to make art again, which is very depressing. But now her work has taken its rightful place alongside the very best of Provincetown printmakers. It has been in several exhibitions and is part of the permanent collection of the Provincetown Art Association and Museum. But her story demonstrates that being out in Provincetown, was not always safe. And women in particular were very vulnerable in a world very much governed by men. So without an advocate or even her family behind her, Edith was committed but had no recourse. It's very sad. Here you can see Edith there and with some kid. Perhaps for this very reason, several of the women printmakers working in Provincetown were much more guarded about their sexuality, preferring to live quietly and more conservatively than the open couples I just described. The artist who most typifies the Provincetown printers, and whose work is perhaps the pinnacle of this style, chose to live rather quietly, although without the influence of men, for sure. Blanche Lizelle was the quintessential independent woman. She grew up on a large farm in Morgantown, West Virginia, to a family that owned several coal mines. And however conservative her family may have been, they allowed her to study art first at West Virginia University, which just at the time was crazy to think she could do that. But then she quickly moved to the Art Students League in New York City and worked under the painters Kenyon Cox and William Merritt Chase. There's a big time. Then she traveled to Paris, of course, where she took classes at several academies of art, including the famous Académie Julienne and the Académie de la Cluse. But she settled in at the Académie Moderne, where she studied with, there were several post-impressionist painters there, kind of radical artists that she studied under. Loisel felt most comfortable at the modern, which was associated with the avant-garde. But it was on a trip to Italy with a group of women that Blanche first heard of Provincetown. Actually, it was from yet another queer couple, Jessie Fremont Herring and Stella Christine Johnson, who invited Blanche to visit Provincetown when she came back to America. Blanche visited Provincetown when she returned to the States, and unlike most of the artists I've described, Blanche made Provincetown her permanent home. Here you can see, well, you can see her studio here. You can see, first of all, on the left, you can see how cold and awful it must have been there in the winter with the snow. I mean, I could just feel it, awful. But it was very, very idyllic in the summertime. She was known for her gardens, for her flowers, and for not allowing anyone to come near them. Her house was basically an old fish house on the pier, and the interior was just covered with paintings and prints. You can see there on the right, her in her studio. And I love this picture of her in the front row there in 1949 at an exhibition in Provincetown, sitting totally apart from the younger, more lively artists in attendance. Blanche was by all accounts described as stern, serious, and independent, a true loner. Although primarily a painter at first, she began to make white line woodcuts in the summer of 1916, like everyone else, after seeing the work of Mars Squire and others at an exhibition in town. Her early efforts weren't great, and I didn't show them here, but here you can see, this is by 1919, she's almost exclusively, she gives up painting. Forget it, painting is too expensive, and it's too expensive, people aren't buying them, so she wants to make prints. So she's exclusively working in the white line technique. And here you can see her entire process from sketch to block to finished print. Like the modernist painting she studied in Paris, her prints employ an almost abstracted view of fractured fishing boats, wharfs, and piers, bordering on cubist in style. The broad, flat blocks of colors don't represent reality, but are rather hotly colored to create an expressionist view of the scene. Her experiments with abstraction continued into the 1920s, including several studies of the figure, simplified into flat planes, greatly informed by her studies with those painters in Paris. As Blanche came to master the white line technique in her ramshackle studio at the end of the pier, she hung the walls of the interior with her prints as a changing sales exhibition for her visitors. And unbelievably, there's a photo of what it looked like. I know it's kind of grainy, but you can see her prints on view in the studio, and they were all for sale. And you can even see the price tags on some of them in the lower right-hand corner. It's just so sweet to think that you could walk in at any time and knock on her door and go in, and I mean, she would open, if you're going to buy, she'd let you in. So, as the studio was open to the public every day during the tourist season, and Blanche started realizing that sales weren't great. So how else can we make money? Well, we'll give demonstrations of this printing method, because I remember I said tourists like to come and watch people paint. Well, then they're definitely going to come and watch someone carving a wood block as well, which then often helped her to sell prints, right? Get them in the door, right? And then twist their arm. She also began to offer classes, and that's when things really blew up. For Loisel, meeting and greeting the tourists was always just a means to make money. And she talks about it a lot in her letters, very candidly. Her painting course was priced at $20 for 4 weeks, while individual block printing courses were $5 a lesson. Sales to museums and galleries started and supplemented her income, but prints don't command the higher prices of paintings. For most of her life, Loisel scratched out a meager income from lessons, print sales, tourist demonstrations, occasional support from family members, and the coal royalties from her family's West Virginia properties, which is unfortunate, but at least she's putting it to good use. By the 1930s and 40s, Blanche Lazelle was nationally known for her white line prints, having shown her work in galleries across the country and securing a spot as one of the artists working for the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. She received, again, another way to make money. She received a stipend in exchange for endorsed works meant to be distributed to government agencies, post offices, libraries, schools, and museums across the country. This print of her hometown, Morgantown, West Virginia, was acquired by the Newark Art Museum in 1943 through this program. And here is another example of one of her WPA prints, also of Morgantown, West Virginia. Lazelle continued to teach through the 1940s and 50s almost exclusively to women. Her lessons were affordable and accessible to women, whereas most print shops at the time were not exactly welcoming to women. Many of Lazelle's students, such as, I have a whole list of names, established their own reputations as white line and woodcut artists. Having learned the techniques in Provincetown while visiting, they took the method back to their various homes, popularizing the white line woodcut networks through networks of women printmakers across the country. So now we start to see the diffusion of this happening. One such artist who did this is Cleveland's own Mabel Hewitt. Born in Conneaut, okay, I guess it's not Cleveland, but, and raised in Youngstown. But she did live in Cleveland, in Parma, actually, for the last 50 years of her life, and exhibited works every year from 1935 to 1956 in the Cleveland Museum of Art's May Show, an annual exhibition that used to happen and was a big deal, but they don't. But it was in 1933 that Mabel visited Provincetown, Massachusetts for one reason: to learn the white line color woodcut method from its most famous practitioner, Blanche Lazelle herself. In her tiny wharf studio during that summer of 1933, Hewitt took several classes with Lazelle. Here you can see one of her early efforts, and this is great because remember I mentioned you can change the color. So this is two prints kind of figuring out the palette, but you can change the colors on the block as you go along. So, you know, you can get a variety. Hewitt explored and then perfected this technique, I would say. Here on the left, you can see the block, and on the right, the finished print. What an amazing, probably my favorite white line print ever, because she is experimenting with modernist ideas and producing now in a later contemporary style. We're talking the 30s now, right? So this is much later. The white line technique was Hewitt's favorite medium, and she used it for over 30 years. She produced scenes of the quaint buildings in Provincetown, views of industrial structures, landscapes, and charming figural scenes from everyday life. Quote, "I like block printing," she explained, "because it gives the family of moderate means an opportunity to have something of color and art in their homes." Like, this is the whole point of printmaking, is that, and she's doing it for the right reasons, you know, so someone like me can afford a print, but I could never afford to do a print now. Hewitt is attracting fresh attention thanks to the gradual donation of a large body of her work to the museum, the Cleveland Museum, by her nephew, William Drury, and his wife, Rose, who started giving prints and other examples of the blocks to the museum in 2003. As a result, the Cleveland Museum of Art now holds the quintessential collection of prints and blocks by the artists that were on view for the show that I talked about earlier, Midwest Modern, the color woodcuts. And this is before they had redone the museum, you can tell. And this was a show that I saw that actually inspired this whole thing in the first place. So I was like, what is this? Why are they doing it like that? And then the next thing you know, rabbit hole. But one of the things that always stuck with me was how little attention was given to the fact, and there's a whole catalog for this show, that Mabel Hewitt, like Blanche Lazelle, was also an independent woman. Whether she was queer isn't really known, it doesn't really matter, but she lived her life described as a spinster, another coded word often used for queer people. During the Great Depression in 1934, you know, Hewitt moved to Cleveland with her sister, Edna, who was a CPA and a weaver, and the two of them lived alone together in Parma for the rest of their lives. Much like Blanche Lazelle, Mabel Hewitt lived on her own terms at a time when a single woman of a certain age was considered suspect. I would argue that that's still happening. Thank you, J.D. Vance. As an artist, Hewitt was able to circumnavigate some of the social norms required of women at the time, but it was her decision to seek out Blanche Lazelle and that colony at Provincetown, specifically to learn printmaking, that I think aligns her to this network of independent women living outside the world of men and using printmaking as this conduit for exchange. Speaking of that network, here is a kind of preliminary look at how these systems of knowledge were communicated between women. And yes, middle to upper class women with the means to travel and afford school. And obviously, these are all very Western places that they're going. We can see that. But, you know, it starts at the art schools in the US. People who had the privilege to be able to go to places like Art Academy of Cincinnati, Art Institute of Chicago, Art Students League. There's many others. And then, because you go to Europe. So then you go to Europe and you go to the art schools in London and Paris in particular. All those academies. London had whole slew of schools. St. John's Wood Art School in particular allowed women to use their printmaking department. Very nice of them. The Royal Academy did not. Teaches Thea Proctor how to make a woodcut and color it with watercolors, you know, like they're doing. And then Thea Proctor is from Sydney. So Thea Proctor, I can't even imagine what that trip, it's not boat. I just did that. I'm sure that that was a train ride. It's some part, but goes all the way back to Australia and starts teaching this technique to people there. Thea Proctor, also queer artist. And I thought what results is kind of this international moment in the 1920s when queer women across the globe were embracing the woodcut as a means of expression, as they could handprint and did not need access to a print shop where these male spaces, you know, where presses were always available. So here on the left, this is a Margaret Preston print, and on the right, that's a Thea Proctor print. And these are just one color. They're actually just the black, and then they hand color with wash the colors. And I thought I would end with this lovely image by Australian printmaker Thea Proctor. As you can see this lovely image, one woman is offering the other a rose to smell, just a simple, intimate exchange between two women in a world in this print that is safe and beautiful. So I thought that was a fitting place to end. Have any questions? I'm sure you do. I have a bibliography that I will share with anyone who is interested. You can email me if you really want to get into it. Yes, sir.
You know, I just read a very interesting book called The Personal Librarian about the lady that helped J.P. Morgan uh,
Yes.
create his masterpiece in New York. But in that book, they referred to a term that I'd never heard. The term was Boston marriage. Apparently, it was a lesbian, but I had never heard that term.
I guess that's referring to Provincetown then, because then
Yeah.
Boston is the nearest town. It's kind of like an Irish goodbye. You know, a Boston marriage is two women living together as partners. I've never come across that. That's great. Yes.
Speaking, all these images were wonderful, but I was so excited to see the photographs that you had of like Blanche in her house and all. Where did you source those images? They were wonderful.
Thank you for asking. It was very hard.
I understand how hard that must have been.
There is one monograph on Blanche Lazelle that contained most of those photos, and my old intern scanned them. Thank you, Abby, wherever you are. And there are other books about the Provincetown printers. There's several books, and in those you can find a lot of good pictures. But they're usually like this big, so then I, have to scan them. But in Provincetown, at the museum, they have an archive, and that's where her papers are. I mean, if you really wanted to go, full in, I'm sure there's photos there.
What is your favorite observed fashion trend? I know that's not what this talk is about.
Yeah, but
like excellent.
I've come across so many shocking things that I would never believe that someone would walk around with. Does anyone know, oh my gosh, what's her name? She works at the Artist Archive and she has half black, half white hair. Oh, anyway, whatever. I said Megan, thank you. To think of a woman in 1915 walking around Provincetown with that hair is shocking to me. I just didn't picture them, and this has to do with signaling and coding. And does anyone know the hanky code? This is an early hanky code, and it's so much more in your face than the hanky code. It's very subtle, This is like woman has orange hair.
Do the colors mean anything?
Yes,
Oh.
yes. Purple is a preferred color. You may have heard of the Lavender Menace, which is something that, if you want to see a print upstairs that even references it, by Wendy Partridge, it's upstairs. So yeah, purple, but purple was also became the color of the suffragettes. And there's definitely some weird crossover between not just suffragettes, but also, what's it called? When you don't drink. Temperance. Thank you. Temperance, yes, the temperance movement, it's okay. And there's some class things going on there with the white women involved, but they kind of co-opted the purple, I guess is what I'm saying. It makes me angry because the purple was coded for lesbians and then the suffragettes took it and then the temperance took it and now purple doesn't have quite the same. But if you have seen pictures of suffragettes in their purple outfits, right? So, but there's far more research. In fact, I would love to write a book just about these fashion choices that were happening in Paris and Berlin and London at this time for queer women, because they're just barely documented, like you'd have to go into actual journals and letters and do primary research to find it. I have a whole talk about Thea Proctor and Margaret Preston that's also on the Zygote YouTube page. And someone mentioned, a man left a comment on there saying that purple had nothing to do with lesbianism. It had to do with Queen Victoria liking purple. And that was the comment. And I just remember looking at that and being like, oh, bless your heart. I'm not even going to respond to that. You can get a whole discussion about purple and how you make purple pigment. That's another story for another. Yes.
Going back several thousand years, purple was connected to nobility by the Greeks and the Romans.
It's because of the little snails.
If you were a commoner wearing purple, you were putting your life in danger.
Yeah, those little, they smash these little snails up. It's really sad. They're what I'm talking
Yeah, murals too.
Yeah, it's sad. We get purple now from others. Yes.
So fascinated by the process because I've seen these, but I didn't realize that's how they're made. Like, how big an addition were these? Because these seem pretty labor
Small,
intensive.
yes.
Do your watercolor on top of.
I need
and
to
then-
add that into the discussion because when you're making prints with like a lithograph, say, you're gonna make hundreds of prints. It's really not that big a chore. But making these, I mean, each one of these is hand colored, first of all. So there's probably only like 5 or 6. The editions were really small. The white line woodcuts were sometimes even smaller, 3, like maybe 3. And I know that you've seen some
Right,
in
right.
real life. So they didn't always use the best papers. And that's become kind of a problem. This is a lesson to all you printmakers out there. I'm looking at Jamie over there too. Make sure you use paper that is archival because some of them have degraded, unfortunately. The ones that were in the trunk and the attic in particular, the Edith Lake Wilkinson prints didn't fare very well. But the blocks exist, so that's cool. But yeah, small editions, very small. I'm sure that, Dorothy McMillan, who's just doing the black line ones, she could do like 50 of those, that'd be easy. But again, they're not using a press, so it's just, it's so, if you've ever made a print just using a spoon, you're like, oh my God. I wish Claudio Orso was here. Does anyone know Claudio's work? He works gigantically large with a spoon, even though there's a press like right next to him. Because that's just, he wants that, also that direct contact with the object is something that we should talk about. You know, when you use a press, it's like there's an interlocutor, right? There's a machine involved, and it's not you, but the human touch is directly going into each one of these. And all prints are, you know, original works of art. They're not copies, but these are even more precious because of how much time it takes to paint one of these. Has anyone ever made a white line woodcut? I tried. Not as easy as it looks. The main thing is making sure that you get that tape on there really tight, because if you even move it a little bit, the registration goes off, and then you've already done, like, say maybe 6 colors, and then you screw it up. You go like, oh my God, and now I have to start over, and then you start over again. So it's hard. Not as hard as a reduction woodcut, which is, you know, for the truly insane. Any other questions or comments? I encourage you all to go look at my talk on Thea Proctor. It's on the Zygote YouTube page. There's a great book about Thea Proctor, and actually I've been in contact with a museum in Australia who they're finally outing Thea Proctor, which is great, and came across my research, and so I might actually be contributing an essay to the catalog.
Thanks. I'm gonna give you a little dollar.
And please, everyone, go and see the prints that are on view. There are not any white line woodcuts. I don't think there's any woodcuts at all. Nope. It's okay. There's lots of prints out there, and go upstairs and see those too. Everything, most of them are for sale. Some of them aren't. Take a look, and let's all just hang out here and try to boost each other's spirits for a little bit, right? Okay, thank you. This dog, did anyone see my, this is my son. It's OSHA, son.
Yeah.